On the morning of January 6, 1914, 10,000 men stood in the freezing dark outside the Ford Motor Company plant in Highland Park, Michigan. The temperature was 9 degrees. Some had ridden freight trains from Alabama. Others had walked from rooming houses across Detroit, arriving before dawn, stomping their feet against the cold. What drew them was a number printed in every major newspaper in the country the day before: $5. $5 a day, more than double what most factory workers in America earned. Henry Ford had announced it on January 5th, and within 24 hours it became the most famous wage in the history of American labor. The crowd outside Highland Park was so large and so desperate that the plant's security force turned fire hoses on them in the freezing air to push them back from the gates. Men stood soaked and shivering, and still they didn't leave. That single announcement set in motion the fastest urban expansion the United States had ever seen. In 1900, Detroit was a solid, unremarkable Midwestern city of 285,000 people. 30 years later, it was 1.6 million, a five-fold increase in a single generation, faster than Chicago in its great boom decades, faster than Los Angeles in the 20s, faster than any American city before or since. And every bit of that growth, every skyscraper, every neighborhood, every fortune, rested on a single product. This is the story of what happens when an entire city makes one bet. Because the automobile gave Detroit everything, and then the automobile took it all away. The French had founded Detroit in 1701. Antoine de la Motte Cadillac, an ambitious fur trader, established it as a post on the narrow strait connecting Lake Erie and Lake Huron, Le Détroit, the strait which gave the settlement its name. For more than a century, it was a frontier town, trading hands between the French, the British, and finally the Americans. In 1805, a fire destroyed nearly the entire settlement. Judge Augustus Woodward, appointed by President Jefferson to oversee the rebuilding, laid out a new city plan modeled partly on Pierre Charles L'Enfant's design for Washington. Grand boulevards radiating outward from central plazas, wide avenues crossing at ambitious angles. It was a plan for a great city. Detroit at the time had fewer than 1,000 residents. But the plan held. As Detroit grew through the 19th century, Woodward's radiating avenues gave it a physical elegance unusual for a Midwestern industrial town. Woodward Avenue itself, the central spoke, became the main commercial street, running straight north from the river. By the 1890s, Detroit was a manufacturing city of real consequence. It was one of the largest stove producers in the country. It built railroad cars and pharmaceuticals, and it had a thriving carriage trade. The machinists and metal workers who built carriages had skills that transferred directly to a new kind of machine. That was Detroit's true advantage when the automobile arrived. Not a plan, but a labor force. Henry Ford built his first gasoline-powered vehicle, a contraption called the quadricycle, basically a buggy frame with a two-cylinder engine, in a brick shed behind his house on Bagley Avenue in the summer of 1896. He had to knock out part of the wall to get it through the door. He wasn't the only one tinkering. Ransom Olds had a workshop in Lansing, just 90 miles away. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, ran a machine shop on Beaubien Street in Detroit. David Dunbar Buick, a plumber turned engine enthusiast, was experimenting nearby. Within a few years, these men were building cars, hiring each other's machinists, buying each other's parts. By 1904, there were more automobile companies in Detroit than in any other city in the world. It happened not because of some grand civic strategy, but because of proximity. The right skills, the right supply chains, the right people, all in the same city at the same moment. The industry was chaotic at first. Dozens of small firms, each producing a few hundred cars a year for wealthy buyers. Ford changed everything. The Model T, introduced in 1908, was designed to be cheap, durable, and repairable by a farmer with a wrench. But what truly revolutionized things wasn't the car, it was the method. In the fall of 1913, at the Highland Park plant, a building designed by the architect Albert Kahn, a name that runs through nearly every chapter of Detroit's story, Ford's engineers installed the first moving assembly line for automobile production. The time to build a single chassis dropped from over 12 hours to about 93 minutes. By 1925, the Ford Motor Company was producing a Model T every 24 seconds, and the price had dropped from $850 to $260. A machine that had been a luxury was now something a factory worker could buy with 3 months' wages. And then came the $5 day. Ford didn't raise wages out of philanthropy. Turnover at Highland Park was devastating. In 1913, the company had to hire more than 52,000 workers over the course of the year just to maintain a workforce of about 14,000. The assembly line was monotonous, physically punishing work, and men quit constantly. The $5 day was a business calculation. Pay enough that nobody leaves. But whatever Ford's motive, the effect was seismic. He had demonstrated that mass production could create a mass middle class, and he'd done it in one city. The word went out across the country, and people came. They came from the Deep South first. African Americans fleeing sharecropping, Jim Crow, and the daily violence of the Cotton Belt, drawn by the promise of factory wages and something resembling dignity. They came from Poland, from Italy, from Syria, from Armenia, from the hollows of Appalachia, from Canadian border towns. Between 1910 and 1930, Detroit's black population grew from roughly 5,700 to 120,000, a 20-fold increase in 20 years. The city's total population nearly quadrupled. Entire neighborhoods materialized in a decade. Streets that had been farmland in 1910 were dense with brick houses, corner groceries, churches, and saloons by 1920. The African American community settled largely in a neighborhood called Black Bottom on the east side near the river. It was crowded, poorly served by city infrastructure, and confined by racial covenants that prevented black residents from buying or renting in most other parts of Detroit. But within those boundaries, a thriving community took root. Paradise Valley, the commercial and entertainment strip along Hastings Street, became one of the most important black business districts in the country. Nightclubs, barbershops, hotels, and restaurants lined the street. On a Friday night in the 1930s or 1940s, you could hear Count Basie or Ella Fitzgerald at one of the clubs on Hastings Street. Then walk 2 blocks for a plate of ribs at a place that wouldn't close until 3 in the morning. The money that poured through Detroit in those decades was staggering. Ford's River Rouge complex, which began construction in 1917 and reached full operation by the late 1920s, was the largest integrated factory on Earth. 1.5 miles long, with its own steel mill, glass plant, rubber processing facility, and power station. Raw iron ore arrived by ship at one end. Finished automobiles rolled out the other. At its peak, more than 100,000 workers clocked in at the Rouge every day. General Motors, headquartered in Detroit, was on its way to becoming the largest corporation in the world by revenue. Chrysler, founded in 1925, grew into a major manufacturer within 5 years. These 3 companies, all based in or near Detroit, dominated the American automobile market and the American economy for the next half-century. The money didn't just build factories. It built a city that looked for a time like it was trying to outdo New York. The man who designed much of it was Albert Kahn. Kahn had arrived in Detroit from Germany as a child, the eldest of 8 in a family with very little money. He taught himself architecture, won a scholarship to study in Europe, and came back to Detroit to build. He became the most prolific industrial architect in American history. He designed Ford's Highland Park plant, the Rouge complex, and eventually hundreds of factories across the country and even in the Soviet Union. But Kahn also designed civic and commercial buildings, and in the 1920s, as automobile money flooded Detroit, he and a handful of other architects transformed the city's skyline. The Fisher Building went up in 1928, a soaring Art Deco tower sheathed in Minnesota granite and Maryland marble, its three-story barrel-vaulted lobby decorated with hand-painted murals and gold leaf. It was commissioned by the 7 Fisher brothers, the same Fishers who had founded Fisher Body, the company that manufactured car bodies for General Motors. And it cost roughly $9 million, about $160 million in today's dollars. Detroiters called it the city's largest art object. The Fisher brothers had planned an identical matching tower on the other side of the arcade. The Depression killed it. The Book-Cadillac Hotel opened in 1924. 33 stories, more than 1,000 rooms, the tallest hotel in the world at the time. The architect was Louis Camper, and the cost was approximately $14 million. The Guardian Building, completed in 1929, was designed by Wirt Rowland in a Mayan Art Deco style that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. The lobby is tiled floor to ceiling in Rookwood and Pewabic pottery, in shades of orange, turquoise, burnt sienna, and gold. The Fox Theater, which opened in 1928, seated more than 5,000 people beneath a ceiling designed to resemble an ornate Siamese temple, with minarets and columns and a projected sky full of stars. And then there was the Michigan Theater, which opened on Bagley Avenue in 1926, a lavishly ornate movie palace designed by the firm of Rapp and Rapp. Bagley Avenue, the same street where Henry Ford had built his quadricycle in a brick shed 30 years earlier. Detroit's entertainment culture was literally built on top of its industrial origins. That detail will matter later. At the center of all this, on Woodward Avenue, stood the J.L. Hudson Company department store. Hudson's had been growing since the 1890s, and by mid-century it occupied an entire city block, reaching 25 stories and more than 2 million square feet of retail space, the largest department store in the world by floor area. At Christmas time, the window displays drew crowds that stretched for blocks. Hudson's was where Detroit's middle class bought its wedding dresses, its living room furniture, its winter coats, its children's school clothes. It was the kind of store that could only exist in a city where working people had real money to spend. Michigan Central Station, that enormous Beaux-Arts rail depot at the edge of the Corktown neighborhood, had opened in December of 1913, just weeks before Ford's $5 day announcement. Designed by Warren and Wetmore and Reed and Stem, the same firms that created Grand Central Terminal in New York, it featured an 18-story office tower rising above a waiting room with marble floors and 54-foot ceilings. It was meant to be Detroit's gateway, the first building that told every arriving train passenger, this is a great city. And there was one more thing about Detroit in its prime. It could fight. When the United States entered the Second World War, Detroit converted its automobile plants to military production with a speed that astonished the world. President Franklin Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, and the phrase was not poetry, it was accounting. Ford built the Willow Run bomber plant, designed once again by Albert Kahn in Ypsilanti Township, a facility so enormous that Charles Lindbergh, visiting during construction, reportedly could not see the far end of the building from the entrance. At peak production, Willow Run was turning out a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 55 minutes. General Motors produced tanks, aircraft engines, and ammunition. Chrysler manufactured the hulls for Sherman tanks. By 1944, Detroit and its surrounding plants were producing more military hardware than the entire Axis powers combined, according to contemporary estimates. The same assembly line that Ford had invented to build cheap cars was now building the machines that won the war. The war was the high watermark, the moment when Detroit's industrial capacity was not merely impressive, but essential to the survival of the free world. Nearly 1.85 million people lived in the city by 1950. It was the 5th largest city in the country. It had the highest median family income of any major American city. Home ownership rates were among the highest in the nation. The public schools were well funded. The Detroit Institute of Arts held a world-class collection, anchored by Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry murals, 27 panels that Rivera had painted in 1932 and 1933 directly on the courtyard walls, depicting the workers and machines of the Ford Rouge plant with a compositional intensity usually reserved for saints and kings. Rivera later said those murals were the finest work of his career. There was every reason to believe the city would keep growing. There was one problem. Every one of those achievements, the income, the architecture, the factories, the cultural institutions, the confident middle class, rested on a single industry. And that industry was about to discover it didn't need Detroit anymore. The deal, the real deal, the one that killed the city, wasn't signed in a boardroom. It was passed by Congress. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, authorizing the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways at a cost of roughly $25 billion, the largest public works project in American history at that time. The automobile industry had lobbied for it for years. General Motors had been among the most aggressive advocates. Charles Wilson, who had been GM's president before Eisenhower appointed him Secretary of Defense, was widely quoted as saying that what was good for General Motors was good for the country. The logic was plain. More highways meant more driving, and more driving meant more cars sold. What nobody said out loud, or perhaps nobody cared to think about, was what the highways would do to the city that built the cars. Detroit's expressway construction had started in the late 1940s and accelerated sharply after the 1956 Act. The Edsel Ford Expressway, the John Lodge Expressway, the Chrysler Freeway, the Fisher Freeway. Every single name honored an automobile executive or an automobile fortune. The highways were literally christened for the industry that would use them to leave. The freeways sliced through Detroit's densest, most established neighborhoods. The heaviest blow fell on Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. In the name of urban renewal and slum clearance, the city demolished virtually the entire area through the late 1950s and early 1960s to build the Chrysler Freeway and the Lafayette Park housing development. Thousands of black residents were displaced with minimal compensation and nowhere comparable to go. The jazz clubs on Hastings Street, the barber shops, the churches, the rooming houses where migrants from Mississippi had found their first foothold in the city, all of it was scraped away for a freeway named after a car company. The highway solved a problem the automobile companies were only too eager to exploit. If workers could drive 20 or 30 miles on an expressway, there was no reason to keep a factory inside the city. A company could build on cheap suburban land with lower taxes, room to expand, and fewer union entanglements. Between the late 1940s and the early 1960s, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler built dozens of new plants in the suburbs: Warren, Livonia, Sterling Heights, Dearborn, and farther out. Older city plants were shuttered or scaled back. The Packard Automotive Plant, another Albert Kahn creation, more than 3.5 million square feet of factory floor spread across 40 acres on East Grand Boulevard, had been abandoned by Packard in 1958 after the company collapsed. It became one of the largest industrial ruins in the world, sinking into itself over the next 6 decades. The workers followed the factories. White families moved to the suburbs in enormous numbers, pulled by new ranch houses and modern schools, and pushed, honestly, by the desire to leave neighborhoods that were becoming increasingly black. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration subsidized suburban mortgages while systematically redlining urban black neighborhoods, making it nearly impossible for black families to follow, even if they had wanted to. Between 1950 and 1970, Detroit lost roughly 350,000 white residents. The suburbs gained approximately the same number. It wasn't natural migration. It was an engineered exodus, enabled by 3 things the automobile industry had either created or championed: the car, the highway, and the suburban subdivision. And here is where the arithmetic turned lethal. Detroit's budget depended on property taxes and income taxes from residents and businesses. As the factories and the middle class relocated beyond the city limits, revenue shrank. But the city's obligations, its pension commitments, its infrastructure, its police and fire departments, its debt service, did not shrink with them. Detroit was left trying to maintain a city built for 1.85 million people with a population that was dropping by tens of thousands every year. Every single year, without pause. Michigan Central Station was still standing in the 1960s, but barely functioning. The automobile had been making the passenger train irrelevant in Detroit for decades. Traffic had been declining since the 1920s. The station was too grand, too expensive to heat and maintain, and increasingly empty. It stood at the edge of Corktown like a monument to a mode of transportation that Detroit itself had helped destroy. And then came the summer of 1967. On July 23rd, police officers raided an unlicensed after-hours club on 12th Street on the city's near west side. It was a routine vice raid. There had been hundreds like it. But this time a crowd gathered. Bottles were thrown. Within hours, fires were burning across the west side. Within 2 days, Governor George Romney called in the Michigan National Guard. By the third day, President Johnson sent the United States Army. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions took positions on the streets of an American city with loaded rifles and fixed bayonets. The violence lasted 5 days. 43 people were killed. More than 1,100 were injured. Over 2,000 buildings were destroyed, most by fire. Property damage was estimated at $50 million in 1967 dollars, something like $450 million today. The causes were deep and structural. Decades of housing discrimination, routine police brutality, a narrowing of economic opportunity in a city where the good factory jobs were increasingly going to the suburbs. The 1967 uprising, call it a riot, call it a rebellion, the facts are the same, cracked open what everyone already knew, and few had been willing to say. The deal between Detroit and the automobile industry had never included everyone equally. And now that the industry was pulling away, the people who had been excluded from the deal's benefits were also the ones least able to leave. White flight, already underway, became a stampede. In the decade after 1967, Detroit lost another 300,000 residents. The city's racial composition shifted dramatically. By 1980, Detroit was roughly 63% black, nearly an inversion of its 1950 demographics. In 1974, Coleman Young became Detroit's first black mayor, winning on a platform of police reform and economic justice. He was smart, combative, and deeply constrained by forces beyond any mayor's control. A shrinking tax base, a hostile suburban and state political establishment, and an automobile industry that was automating away the very jobs that had built the city's middle class. In 1977, Henry Ford II, grandson of the founder, championed the construction of the Renaissance Center, a massive complex of glass towers on the riverfront intended to signal Detroit's revival. It cost roughly $350 million and was designed by John Portman, known for dramatic interior spaces. The Ren-Sen, as Detroiters called it, was supposed to pull businesses and shoppers back downtown. Instead, it functioned more like a fortress. Its disorienting circular layout and elevated walkways effectively sealed it off from the surrounding streets. A person could spend an entire day inside the Renaissance Center without ever stepping onto a Detroit sidewalk. The building, meant to reconnect downtown to its citizens, gave them one more reason not to engage with the city outside. The decline ground on. Hudson's department store, the anchor of Woodward Avenue, the place where half the city had bought Christmas presents for generations, saw revenue fall year after year as customers migrated to suburban malls. The downtown flagship, which had recorded annual sales of roughly $153 million in the early 1950s, bled customers steadily through the 60s and 70s. The upper floors closed. Entire departments vanished. The store shut its doors in 1983. The building stood vacant for 15 years before the city demolished it with controlled explosives on live television on October 24, 1998. The implosion of the Hudson's building, 25 stories of brick and terracotta, the tallest department store ever brought down, took about 30 seconds. 2 million square feet of retail space became a cloud of dust above Woodward Avenue. The Book-Cadillac Hotel, the tallest hotel in the world when it opened in 1924, closed in 1984. Its ballrooms filled with standing water. Plaster ceilings collapsed. Pigeons nested in the grand lobby. And the Michigan Theater on Bagley Avenue, the ornate movie palace built on the very site where Henry Ford had assembled the quadricycle, was converted into a parking structure. The auditorium still exists, technically. Cars park on a poured concrete slab beneath the theater's painted ceiling, between its Corinthian columns. It may be the most photographed parking garage in the world, because it is the most eloquent one. Automobiles stored inside a theater, in the city that built the automobile, on the street where the first one was born. Michigan Central Station saw its last Amtrak train pull out on January 6, 1988. After that, the doors were locked. Nobody came back. The waiting room's marble floors buckled. The office tower's windows blew out, one by one, until the upper floors were open to the weather. Rain and snow poured through the building for decades. It became the most recognized image of urban ruin in America, reproduced in films, documentaries, album covers, and the background of every story about what happens when a city dies. By the early 1980s, the relationship between Detroit and the automobile industry had curdled into something resembling extortion. The city needed the companies to survive. The companies knew it. In 1981, General Motors told Mayor Coleman Young it wanted to build a new assembly plant, a state-of-the-art facility that would bring 6,000 jobs. But GM needed a site, a large one, flat, with rail access. The site it chose straddled Detroit and the adjacent city of Hamtramck in a neighborhood known as Poletown, named for the Polish immigrants who had settled there a century earlier. Poletown was a living neighborhood. It had roughly 4,200 residents, some 1,500 homes, 144 businesses, 16 churches, a hospital, and a school. Some families had lived there for 3 generations. GM's message was blunt: clear the land or we build somewhere else. Mayor Young, who had watched factories abandon Detroit for 20 years, who understood exactly what 6,000 jobs meant to a city hemorrhaging employment, agreed. The city invoked eminent domain. Over roughly 14 months, the entire neighborhood was demolished. Families were relocated. Businesses were shut down. The Immaculate Conception Church, a Polish Catholic parish that had served the community since the late 19th century, was razed despite a sit-in by elderly parishioners who had to be physically carried out by police. The public cost was approximately $200 million in land acquisition, relocation payments, demolition, and site preparation, underwritten by the city, the state, and federal grants. GM's promise? 6,000 jobs. The plant opened in 1985. It never employed more than roughly 3,000 workers at any one time. 6,000 was a number on paper, written to justify the destruction of a neighborhood. That was the deal. Not a deal between equals, a deal between a city with no leverage and a corporation that knew it had all of it. Detroit had given the automobile industry its land, its labor, its tax abatements, its loyalty, and now its own neighborhoods. In return, the industry delivered a fraction of what it promised. Poletown didn't cause Detroit's collapse, but it was the clearest possible expression of what the city's dependence on a single industry actually cost when the dependency was total and the power was entirely one-sided. The population kept falling. Detroit had peaked at 1.85 million in 1950. By 1990, it was below a million. By 2010, it was 713,000, a loss of more than 1 million people in 60 years. In some neighborhoods, vacancy rates exceeded 50%. Whole city blocks had a single occupied house, surrounded by empty lots where abandoned structures had been torn down or had simply collapsed. Prairie grass grew where homes had stood. Pheasants were spotted on the east side. The city maintained roughly 140 square miles of land, the same area it had needed for 1.85 million residents, on taxes generated by fewer than 700,000, many of them poor. On Devil's Night, the night before Halloween, which had become an annual arson ritual in Detroit, hundreds of fires were set across the city in the 1980s and early 1990s. The city eventually mobilized tens of thousands of volunteer patrols to watch the neighborhoods on those nights, an extraordinary civic effort born from an extraordinary failure of the systems that were supposed to keep the city functional. The finances were a slow-motion catastrophe. Successive administrations borrowed to cover operating deficits, deferred pension contributions, and issued bonds backed by revenue that would never materialize. By the 2000s, Detroit was spending more on debt service and legacy costs than on basic services. On July 18, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The city owed somewhere between $18 billion and $20 billion, depending on how long-term pension and retiree health care obligations were calculated. The bankruptcy was managed by Kevin Orr, an emergency manager appointed by Michigan's governor and empowered to override the elected city government. Creditors demanded to be paid. Bond insurers argued that everything should be on the table, including the collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts. The DIA held more than 65,000 works. Among them were Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry murals, those 27 panels depicting the Rouge plant's blast furnaces and assembly lines, the workers' hands and bodies, the chemistry of industrial production, rendered with the compositional gravity of Renaissance frescoes. Rivera had painted them directly onto the museum's courtyard walls. They could not be removed without being destroyed. But other works could be sold, and the creditors' lawyers began appraising them: the Bruegel, the Van Gogh, the Rembrandt. A great American city's art collection assembled over a century to be auctioned off to satisfy the banks. What saved the collection was a deal called the Grand Bargain. 13 private foundations, led by the Ford Foundation and the Kresge Foundation, joined with the state of Michigan to pledge approximately $816 million. The money would flow into the city's pension fund, softening the cuts to retired municipal workers, the firefighters, the bus drivers, the water department employees who had spent careers working for a city that had been the richest in America within their own lifetimes. In exchange, the DIA's collection was transferred to an independent charitable trust, permanently beyond the reach of future creditors. Pensions were still cut, but not catastrophically. The art stayed. It was an extraordinary act of civic rescue. It was also a confession. The city that had generated more industrial wealth than any place on earth needed philanthropists to pass the hat to keep its museum and its pensioners intact. Detroit emerged from bankruptcy in December 2014, having shed billions in debt, cut services and pensions, and, in the bureaucratic language of the proceedings, right-sized itself. A term meaning the machinery of government has been adjusted to fit a population one-third the size of what it was, and everyone will try not to think too carefully about what that means. Here is what the deal cost. Not the Poletown deal, not the Grand Bargain. The original deal, the one Detroit made in the first decades of the 20th century, when it handed its identity, its economy, its infrastructure, and its future to the automobile. At its peak, the deal produced the highest median income in urban America. It produced a skyline of Art Deco towers built with factory money. It produced a department store that filled a city block and a hotel that was the tallest in the world, and a movie theater rising on the exact spot where the first car was built. It produced Motown Records, founded by Berry Gordy in a house on West Grand Boulevard in 1959. A hit factory that gave the world Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder. Gordy organized his label along the same assembly line principles that Ford had pioneered. each songwriter and producer handled one phase of the creative process, and the product rolled out polished and ready for the national market. Even Detroit's music was shaped by the automobile's logic. But the deal required that everything go right, forever. It required that the auto industry never automate, never relocate, never contract. It required that highways never be built, or that if they were, people would choose not to use them. It required that suburbs never offer cheaper land, lower taxes, and newer schools. It required that racial covenants and redlining never generate the pressures that eventually exploded. It required, in short, that the 20th century not happen the way it happened. No city could have survived that bet. But no city made the bet as completely as Detroit did. In June of 2024, Ford Motor Company held a ceremony at Michigan Central Station. Ford had purchased the ruin in 2018 for a reported $90 million, then spent several years and hundreds of millions of dollars on a comprehensive restoration. The waiting room's vaulted ceilings were repaired. The office tower was rebuilt floor by floor. The marble was cleaned, the brass polished, the arched windows reglazed. New tenants moved in. Technology researchers, mobility engineers, startup companies working on electric vehicles and autonomous systems. Ford called the restored building a hub for the future of transportation. The company that had done more than any other to make the private automobile the dominant mode of transportation in America. The company whose $5 day had started the great boom, whose factories had drawn the millions, whose product had made the highways possible, now owned the train station. The depot, built in 1913 for a mode of travel that the automobile spent the next century rendering obsolete, had become, in its second life, a showcase for the next generation of the same product that had emptied it in the first place. Stand inside Michigan Central today and you can see what restoration buys. The Beaux-Arts waiting room flooded with light, marble gleaming, the proportions still magnificent. It is a genuinely beautiful space. Walk outside, and in the surrounding blocks of Corktown, the neighborhood that never fully recovered from decades of abandonment, there are still vacant lots and boarded windows, though new development is beginning to arrive. Detroit's population in the 2020 census was 639,111. That is roughly what it had been in 1920, before the automobile remade it into something unprecedented. A full century of explosive growth and prolonged loss, and the city arrived back at the number where it started, except that the factories are largely gone, and many of the neighborhoods are gone, and the department store is gone, and the Grand Hotel stood empty for 20 years before someone finally restored it, and the movie theater is a parking garage. The stoves Detroit manufactured before the automobile arrived, nobody remembers those. The cars? Everybody remembers the cars. The city staked everything on them, and for a generation it was the most extraordinary wager in American urban history. On a freezing morning in January 1914, 10,000 men stood outside a factory gate soaked with fire hose water in 9-degree air and refused to leave. By the time it was over, that $5 promise had drawn nearly 2 million people to a city that would spend the rest of the century learning what happens when the line shuts down and the money moves, and the only product you ever had doesn't need your city to make it anymore.